Hello everyone, welcome to your next section. Today we're going to be talking about functions, how to build the basic function. We're going to learn a little bit about this thing called a return command within functions. And then we're going to build our own and deal with some of the syntax and show you how to create a simple one. Functions are extremely useful. Turns out you've been using functions all along and you haven't really been realizing it. All of those little dot commands that you've been doing on an object, all of that stuff is, using essentially a function on that object. So functions are really useful when you're doing repetitive coding tasks. So you have the same 5, 6, 10 lines of code that you use over and over again. So rather than copying and pasting that same thing all the time, you create a function that you declare earlier on that Python can read ahead of time, and then instead of running that same 6 lines of code and copy and paste, you just kind of pass the parameters that you need into one line of code and it'll give you everything that you need. So functions are really useful both for optimizing your code, but also for understanding and handling code that's already been made for you, either officially by the Python creators or unofficially by hackers or very interested groups that want to make coding life easier, or somehow build a company out of building smart, good code. So with that in mind, guys, what we're going to learn today is we're going to learn exactly what functions are. I'm going to teach you the syntax of a function, how exactly you should build them from scratch and what it looks like. I'm going to teach you how to pass variables through that function and return a value from that function processing. So you remember how with some of our commands like .pop, how it would return a value, the value that you popped out of it at the end. A lot of times with our functions, we want our functions to do some additional processing on an object and return the output or some result from that. So learning how to return a response is going to be a critical feature of building functions because you'll use it all the time. So some definitions. First, what is a function? Again, functions are a collection of code that can be called using a single command. You kind of reference that chunk of code ahead of time and say, I want all of this code to be represented by this label. And then you can pass variables into that label and it'll give you some sort of processing a response. You don't actually have to have it pass any variables through it. You can have it just run some background process with no additional parameters. But we're going to show you the syntax with parameters included because chances are you will use that more than often. And then the return statement is if you pass some information through or not, but you have something that you want to return as a response to that processing, that's what the return statement is for. And we'll show you what that's all about in just a second. Okay, with that in mind, guys, how about we hop into our syntax for now? So this is how we build a function. There's a few things that I want to show you here, but first and foremost, this first line is the syntax of a function. So we first write def for define. We then label what our function is going to be called. I'm gonna create a function that adds 10 to whatever parameter we pass through this function. Okay. The function syntax requires that you have the regular braces here. You can have no parameters in it and just have it as an empty brace with a colon. But in this case, I've created one parameter. I said, okay, this function needs one input. You'll see what that looks like later here in order for it to run because we're going to do stuff with that parameter. So in this case, this function requires one thing to be passed through it. You can have multiple functions and they're delineated by commas. So you can have parameter 1, parameter 2, parameter 3 and label them any way you want. But once you're done labeling your parameters, you stop it with a colon. Now remember what happens when we get a colon. Everything that's going to be processed with this function needs to be indented one space until we're done creating a function for this until we're done creating this function, and then it can go back to where the original indent here. Okay, this next line here is something I want to show you. When you use the hashtag symbol in Python, that's called a comment symbol. So everything that comes to the right of that hashtag will not run as code. So basically what we use the hashtag symbol for is to comment our code. We use it to give ourselves notes to remind us, okay, well, we need to do something here, debug or something. or we give comments to other coders to tell them what this function is doing or what we're trying to do with this code. So get familiar with using comments and seeing comments in code, because it's a really important feature. You should be commenting your code a lot. So okay, now that we've looked at what this comment thing is all about, we have our function, which is really just taking in a parameter and running an if conditional statement on it. It's checking, the first if statement is checking if our parameter is not an integer. So if it's not an integer, that means this will be true. And then it will not do anything. It'll just pass. So meaning if it's a string, if it's a list, nothing will happen. Okay. Otherwise, that means that this would have to be, false or something. It will then say, otherwise, if this does equal an integer, that means that this is going to return as false, meaning we have an integer, and so we've found an integer here, and what we're doing is we're going to add 10 to this parameter, but we're also going to do return. And what return does is it will output the response of this function. It will essentially, if we were to run this function here, it will give you the parameter plus 10, p plus 10, and the response will be that. You'll see in this last line here, this is unindented. This is actually how we call our function. We simply just, we write add 10, we make sure there's parentheses, and because this does have a parameter that it needs, I give it the number 3. And so what we'll return here, if I did this, it will output in Python as just 13. Okay? Because it's 3 plus 10. That's the syntax of a function, all right? Why don't we go into a Sublime Text or a Python script, as well as go into our Udemy Python script folder in Bash and start playing around with this and seeing what happens, okay? So I'm going to go into Sublime Text, as you see here, and I'm opening up my terminal. Excellent. So I've already kind of pre-built this for you. Be sure to write this out yourself in a script if you'd like to go along with me. But how I'm doing this is I'm going to save this script as add10.py. Telling it .py just lets your text editor know that this is a Python script and it should color it as such. It also is just a good way to keep your stuff organized. So .python here, we're going to save that as add10.py in our folder. And let's see what happens when we run this in that folder. Python add10.py. It says integer found, but look, nothing output. Why? Because that just goes to the console. It didn't print the response to this. So if we go x equals add10 and then print x, what would we expect? 13. So it does come out. So one thing to realize, guys, when you're scripting, unless you're using print, you're not going to find the results of things that come out. And the reason for that is when we're in base Python, those responses are not printing to a standard out that Bash can see. So you use print as a way to debug and to check to make sure things are running as you would expect them to. So that's what happens when we do x add 3 here. What happens if we remove this parameter? What do we expect to happen to this function here? Let's just do a check here like that. Well, we get an error. It says missing one required positional argument, parameter 1. It's saying that there's no parameter here. I need a parameter, especially because, it's saying at line 9, yeah, something's not right here. It needed a parameter. It didn't even try and go through anything to make this work. Let's add this here, and instead of passing, we say print not an integer. And now in order to make sure that this code actually runs, we have to save. I'm using the shortcut here, but you save your script so that way this print command is actually now, in Bash, it actually preserves it. And let's do Python add 10 with, hello instead of a number and see what happens. It prints not an integer, and rather than erroring out, this is one way that we've caught this information. You also notice that it didn't error on this do stuff here as well. Okay, so if we wanted to make another function, how would we do it? We go def again, sub3. And we just do the same thing, param2. We're going to call it param1 as well. And this will be interesting because this is going to bring you into what we're going to talk about next class, which is scope. Let's actually show you all that here. And let's do add 10. Let's just do, yeah, we'll do x equals add 10, y equals add 3. Sub 3 is what we wanted, sub 3. And let's subtract 3 from this and see what happens. We have param1 and param1 for both of these. This is going to kind of allude to you what possibly could happen in your next section when we talk about scope, which is like what happens when you have this parameter in here, but param1 equals 12 here. Let's see what happens. Integer found, integer found. Let's also print the x and y now, x, y. Okay, what happened here? We got 11 and -1, even though we said 1 and 2 here. Okay, so this is going to teach you a little bit about what we need to know for our next section, which is about global and local parameters. Let's remove that parameter 1 and see what now happens. We have 11 and 1. Oh, did that save? There we go. So we have 11 and... Oh, no, actually that did work, guys. Let's try this again. Let's try param1 equals 22. Now, it worked just fine. But this is going to be an issue later on. You'll see what I mean. We're going to talk about global and local parameters as a result of this, okay? So keep that in mind, and when we go into our next section, this will all make a lot of sense what I'm talking about, okay? So let's just do a quick recap. What did we learn today, guys? We learned about functions, how to build a basic function syntax. We learned about what parameters are, how to pass parameters into a function, and then how to call functions and use the return command to get results back from our functions when we call them. So with that in mind, guys, let's see you in the next section where I'm going to talk about global and local scope, some of that issues that I was showing you with the parameter 1 at the end there. That's all going to come together because I'm sure you can understand how that can be confusing. What happens when you have that parameter already labeled and then it passes into a function or vice versa? And that's what we're going to talk about, global and local variables. All right, guys, thank you very much, and I'll see you in that class.